Okay, we're going to start now. Let's just take a deep breath. Ooh, we're here. We've arrived, getting situated in this space. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this iteration of Participedia Teaching Cafe series, Democracy Archives. For those that don't know, Participedia is the largest database and one of the largest interdisciplinary communities researching and mobilizing knowledge about democracy and democratic innovation from around the world. This event is brought together in partnership with the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, the History Department, the Wilson Center for the Study of Canadian History, and of course, SSHRC, and the generous contributions of our speakers and dedicated research assistants. Unfortunately, and perhaps speaking to the multiple relationalities of archivists, Krista could not be here today and had to cancel last minute due to a labor dispute at Algoma, but nonetheless gives her regards and wish she could attend in person. Before offering a few words of framing for the session from a normative democratic standpoint, I want to start with our Participedia Global Land Acknowledgement. For Participedia community members, you're very familiar with this. Although a digital database and global community, Participedia is grounded at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, what is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga nations. This land is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The agreement describes the dish to represent the territory and one spoon to symbolize the peoples living on and sharing the resources of the land, only taking what we need and keeping the dish clean. We recognize the ongoing effects of colonial processes of erasure, marginalization, and extraction, of which we are all intimately a part. And we encourage those joining us today, online and virtually, to reflect solidaristically on the Indigenous sovereignties, colonial legacies, and life relations on the land in which you are residing or find yourself on in this moment. So our session will unfold in two parts. We will begin with our panel and an open conversation moderated by Sarah, followed by a participatory activity that invites us to engage the ethical and political dilemmas of memory work. To start though, I want to offer some framing from a normative democratic perspective. So this cafe reflects on the place of archives and archival practice in the ongoing work of democracy. At its heart, democracy is a project of collective self-governance, an ongoing process of cultivating the capacities, relationships, and institutions that enable individuals and groups to exercise agency over the conditions of their lives while sustaining the possibilities of flourishing worlds for generations to come. It depends on our capacity to share our histories, to confront them with honesty, and to make space for those whose voices have been excluded, violently so. Now, archives, in their multiplicity of form and location, are where these histories are often assembled, disputed, and remade. They are sites where democracy's promises and failures are recorded, and where struggles for justice, recognition, and belonging continue to unfold. To think about the archives then is to think about how democracy defines itself, who is counted, who is heard, and whose stories become part of the collective record and imaginaries we govern ourselves by. To be sure, every archive is built through acts of selection, classification, and exclusion. These are not neutral processes. We'll learn about that today. They shape the very boundaries of belonging, the contours of truth, and the reach of responsibility. They are political by nature. The history of archives is deeply entangled with the history of war and colonization. Archives were instruments for cataloging peoples, territories, and resources. They did not simply record the world, they ordered it within the context of the violent solidification of monarchical and state power and the expansion of racial capitalism and coloniality across the globe, transforming the fluidity and entanglement of lived co-constitutive experience. And yet, at the same time, archives have also been spaces of creative survival, of joy, love, intimacy, care, legacy, community, remembrance, accountability, and imagination. Across liberation movements, for example, communities have created counter archives that keep alive what dominant narratives have sought to erase. These archives and epistemic practices of memory work insist on a different future, right? One grounded in good relation, accountability, responsibility, respect, self-governance, and repair. This is why I think the question of the archives remains central to the normative struggle for democracy. Around the world, we are witnessing again how political leaders, self-styled strongmen like Trump, mobilize archives and histories to legitimize exclusionary policies, to rewrite violence as virtue, and to reassert myths of national purity. I mean, this is also much closer to home, as we'll hear today from some of our panelists. In other contexts, which we'll hear about in part 2 of this event in the winter, in other contexts like in Palestine, we see the complete targeted destruction of universities and archival sites, right? We'll have 2 archivists here with us next term. At the same time, many archives that hold the fragile traces of collective struggle, life in all its joy, pain, and possibility, remain criminally underfunded. In a state of literal decay, some are inaccessible or at risk of closure. The work of preserving memory requires sustained public commitment and policy choices through funding, open co-design with community, infrastructure development, and above all, care. When archives are neglected, when communities are not able to tell their own stories and are left out, democracy itself becomes vulnerable to amnesia, distortion, and manipulation. To think about democracy and archives is therefore to grapple and recognize this profound tension. Archives can serve domination or liberation, empire or emancipation. They can reproduce hierarchies of knowledge, or they can open space for shared authorship and pluriversality, including all the possibilities in between and beyond. They can be both the instruments of colonization and at the front lines of its undoing. It is in this spirit today that we embrace this messy complexity together. But having conversations such as these can sometimes be difficult. They can be intense. And so as we move into our workshop, we want to hold this space in the spirit of democratic practice, one grounded in care, mutual respect for each other, and an openness to difference. Our conversation and time spent together will honor brave and generous listening, recognizing that difficult conversations and discussions are part of collective learning. They're part of democracy. We invite everyone to engage with humility and curiosity, but again, above all, respect, making room for multiple truths and perspectives to emerge in dialogue, and what I hope will create space for generative deliberation to emerge. So that's enough from me. Thank you once again to everyone for joining us in person and online, to our panelists and to our team of research assistants. I will now pass it off to Sarah to open the conversation with our panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is going to be a very, very beautiful and productive workshop. So I'm grateful to have you all here with us today. As Paul said, I'm just going to open this very quickly with a few words of my own, and then I'm going to pass it off to our very lovely panelists today. So my name is Sarah. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of History at McMaster. I am a research assistant for Participedia, and I'm also a research assistant for the Wilson Institute for Canadian History. So I'm quite literally everywhere on campus. If you see me, probably have at some point, please say hi. I can't escape. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about my own work today. So I'm an environmental historian. I do Indigenous and environmental history. And that means that I've worked quite a bit with the archives in my time doing my doctoral work. So I focus on the Indigenous communities of Newfoundland and Labrador. My father's family's from there. My father is part Indigenous himself, so this is working with my own community. And this is something that I have had to kind of toe the line a little bit with, because I think it can be very complicated dealing with archives, but then dealing with your own community histories at the same time. So there's a common saying in environmental history, and we talk about how the land is loud. When you research the land that you live on, you research the land that you come from, the land speaks to you. It's a very loud place to interact with. And I think the same thing can be said about archives. The archives can be very, very loud at times. And I think can speak to you in ways that you won't necessarily expect it to, or maybe want it to at times. But on the contrast, I also do think that quite opposite can happen. I think sometimes archives can be very silent. I had a wonderful conversation the other day with my colleague, Matt Longrose, who's one of the facilitators today. And he said something that really stuck with me, where he said, you have to be comfortable with the silence sometimes. You learn to be comfortable with the silence. And I think that's a process that you have to get to as a graduate student. So just some stuff that I've experienced in my own work. There's a lot of ghosts in my research, a lot of missing pieces, a lot of pieces that aren't there at all. And I think as researchers, at times we have to struggle with finding the difference between, filling in the gaps, but then adopting stories as our own. Because the last thing you ever really want to do is take on someone's story that's not yours, turn it into something that it's not. And I think that's a balance you have to find. So something that I've had to deal with personally is, stories that I thought I was going to go into the archives that are completely different than what I thought originally. So going in and kind of having that moment where you have to step back and be like, oh, this is not at all actually what I thought it was. This is something completely different. And maybe now my chapter's different, or my project's different, or the whole approach that I was going to have towards this is something different, because I need to still honor this research, even though it's something different than when I first thought it was. And I hope that this workshop today can be something where we can explore here how to address those conversations, because I think they're important ones to have. There's also, we need to talk about gaps in the archives. I think, especially when you're working with communities that haven't been represented, you need to talk about language. There's a lot of languages that aren't represented in archives. So addressing those kind of gaps there. There are stories that aren't being told because they weren't translated into a language that's compatible with an archive. Me and myself, when I work with Mi'kmaq history, there's a lot of histories that I don't find in the archives, and then I have to go elsewhere for because they weren't translated into English or French, or a language that would be upheld in a Canadian institution. So I think it's something that's very important there to think about, what gaps are you missing in terms of language? Also, I think we still need to have conversations about terminology itself. I've had a very interesting perspective at times, being part Indigenous myself, and then searching up terminology that it would be very offensive to me in my community because that's what it's listed under. And so, really addressing those things that need to happen there. But also, I think you have to code switch a little bit. You have to learn that, okay, sometimes I'm going to have to play the game to be able to find the things that I'm looking for. And that's okay. But then it's my job as, a researcher and a member of my community to then represent it in a way that my community wants. So taking those things and kind of transforming it into something that I think can be much more productive and uphold the history from before. So with that, I think one more thing I do want to say before I pass it on to our panelists is I think there's also times where you need to acknowledge when stories won't be told, and that's okay. There's just going to be times where you go into archives, you're not going to find what you're looking for, and sometimes you never will. And I think at times it can be very disappointing for that to happen, especially when you go in looking for a story that's going to be told and it's just not there. And I also think that includes stories that maybe you did find, but they're not for you to tell. And remembering that, being okay with that, remembering that sometimes it's just for someone else to tell and it's for the community only, it's not for it to be shared with the public. So I think there's a lot of amazing conversations we're going to have here today. I'm very grateful to be moderating this panel, and I encourage you all to think about your own ghosting, your own research, how to deal with silences, how to deal with things that are screaming at you, and just navigating those complexities in a way that we can move forward in a more inclusive and positive life. Woo! So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little more in depth, but we're joined by Myron from McMaster University, Michelle from York University, Denali from University of British Columbia, Melissa from our Black Toronto Collective in Toronto, Roberta from the University of Lisbon, and Krista from Algoma University. It is my utmost honor to welcome you all today, and thank you for your participation.
Now, do you want to invite the first speaker?
Yes. So I think our first speaker that we have in order is Myron. So
All right, grab my slide. I'm gonna do my best because my slides are also my speaking notes. So I'm gonna try and not look at two things at once, but I probably won't be too terribly successful. I've entitled this talk, Quo Vadis, Archives and Democracy. Latin phrase means where are we going with all this? And that's gonna be the kind of theme that animates my talk today. Next slide, please. I guess I'll start by saying a little bit about me, but a very little. What's my deal anyway? Well, I spent about 20 years working in archives, in libraries, and museums, in special collections. During that 20-year time period, I took some time out to pursue master's studies in archival studies and another degree in library information studies. So this is both my bread and butter and an area that is very theoretically alive to me. It's an area of scholarship for me. I'm also a historian. That's where I started before I came into archives, and I was sort of led into archives from history. And if I've learned anything from my studies in history, it's that things are complicated. They're more complicated than I think they are. And the more I look at them, the more complicated they get. And I must admit, sometimes I'm a little uncomfortable with high archival rhetoric, because as a historian, I'm like, well, these are systems that kind of coalesced originally in medieval chancery systems, and they were really mostly concerned with adjudicating frameworks of relationality and rights and responsibilities in that context. And then there was another iteration in Italy in the 16th century where there was an internal reform movement in the Catholic Church. And then they became all this other shit. So it's very, very complex legacy. I've also been an immigrant 3 times in my life. Canada's the 4th country that I've lived in. So you could say that I am a goal-oriented spelunker of different political endealments and vibes, figuring out how political systems work, facing the final boss of swearing an oath to the King of England after my ancestors fought really hard to whoop his ancestors' asses in the American Revolution. Very complex for me. So figuring all that out kind of entails an above average amount of attention to formal political processes. As for archival engagement, something that the organizers asked us to speak to, I have done a lot of different activities within the practice of kind of like formal archival work over the last 20 years, including the arrangement and description, that is a sort of a cataloging adjacent process for archives, the active translation that makes them accessible for users. I've had a not inconsiderable amount of advocacy work and hype work. I was a very annoying niche internet micro celebrity about 10 years ago during some very bad cuts that were happening in the federal government. I achieved nothing, I fully admit. I've done a reasonable amount of policy advisory. I've occasionally been useful to sitting governments or their enemies. In my current role, I do a little bit of program administration. I work with donors. I work with collection development, with the stewardship of archival collections. And one of the things I'm really enjoying is seeing a lot of familiar faces in this room, people I've had the opportunity to teach and learn from over the years. Because at this point, I actually do quite a bit of archival teaching, archivally directed teaching. And I see some colleagues who have helped me in that work and some people I have taught. Now, archival silences are a massive subject and not something that I can cover easily. So I can speak as someone that works in maybe a little bit more of a formally constituted archival setting, some of the ways that we approach these in our work. And the first way of approaching archival science is through honesty. Honesty about the capacity that you actually possess as an institution. Humility about what you can and can't do, what the bounds of your legal obligations are, what the bounds of how far you can pursue frameworks of relationality are, and being really honest about what your archival capacity is, because it's very, very easy as an archivist to overpromise and underdeliver. I think addressing archival silences also involves advocacy for more capacity for archives. And that includes fighting to ensure that archivists are actually compensated enough that they can pursue this work and that we can pluralize the resource base of the sorts of people that work in archives. I come from a background where, this isn't a hobby for me. This is the way that I pay my bills. I think we really need to be aware of the labor in archival spaces, how it is compensated, how it is credentialed, and how we can expand those conversations. And that starts with money. I think we also have a duty to improve the representation in our collections. to improve the networks of relationality we have with our donors and the people with whom our records originate. And I'm happy to talk about that more in our small discussions later on. And I'm also struck by a need to move beyond, this is something my friend Jessie Lawyer, who's an Indigenous librarian in Alberta, once said to me. She's like, Myron, libraries and archives are great, but I'd really like us to see them move beyond reflecting the singular collecting joy of white men. That's good and all, but singular collecting joy is a much broader phenomenon than being merely invested in old white dudes. Collecting, preserving, storytelling are very human activities, and they go beyond the bounds of one identity. And I think we're really face an imperative to expand the scope of what that looks like. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you through a few frameworks, and forgive me, my students, if you've ever seen these before, to help us think about what archives are. I would say that first and foremost, to me as an archivist, archives are repositories of evidence. They're places that we seek historical fact insofar as it's provable in court. Archives started as an adjunct to the legal profession, and in the state level, they stay there. So archives are places that we can look for understanding and redress for bad things that happened in our past. Next slide. Archives also, of course, repositories of narrative, storytelling, places we draw on conceptions of a shared past or an unshared past and an imagined future toward which we're going. So archives are places that help us tell the story of who we are as individuals, communities, bodies, politic, etc. Next. I'm into this. It's spooky season still, technically. So I think archives are also tombs, right? These are places that we go to inter our documentary ancestors. And we respectfully inter and distance them from the precincts of daily life. So archives can be sites of mourning, collective remembrance, forgetting, and celebration. Next. Archives, and we've heard about this a little bit today, are certainly barriers, places that privilege who has access to records, how they have access to records, how fact representation and story are reflected in the policies of organization. In other words, places of otherings where we examine, define the context of who is we, who's inside the community, who's outside of it. Are those things porous? Are they not? How do we construct knowledge and so on? Archives also gateways, right? They're places that the information can get out of the archives and shape the world, so we hope. Places that information power is traveling bi-directionally. Places that we in archives are crossing thresholds to become different selves. And in all this, archives are kind of perpetually contested sites, places that we problematize and revisit theories and material legacies of our past, places we go to build, refine, break, rebuild ideas about ourselves and the world. Next slide. Okay, this is the ancient lore. This is the kind of maximalist archival theory in which I was schooled. And this is the archival theory that really regulates state-level archives, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly today. I think many other aspects of our discourse are going to be ably covered by other panelists. So formal archival theory is concerned with evidence of how historical persons function. Organizations, state organs, exchequers, chancelleries, ministries, etc. How do they work? How do they make decisions? How are those decisions documented? How are they affected? How are they not affected? How are they obfuscated? So they're providing us with evidence of how complex organizations function. And the associated kind of custodial principles that have grown from that theory and the descriptive principles that have grown from that theory help archives to provide direct evidence of things that have happened in the past. They help us to use archives as sites and sources for the legal adjudication of competing truth claims. And they give us insights into how power and privilege are apportioned, exercised, and contested. Next slide. Okay, democratic context. Democracy, as Paul said at the beginning, is a macro-scale collective project, right? A series of unevenly distributed enfranchisements, political enfranchisements. I would say an imperative to continue perfecting those enfranchisements, and an ongoing shared responsibility to one another. Archives and democracy, you've heard the phrase, so-and-so kept the receipts. Archives are the receipts. They contain knowledge about what works, what doesn't. They give us a hedge against autocratic sea changes, and they give us a crucial, irreplaceable public accountability framework. Next. Okay, shit's not great in the global democratic context. We have a political and aesthetic discourse chiefly driven by for-profit technologies that monetize setting us at one another's throats. That is their purpose. They may feel nice, but they deserve to make us hate ourselves and each other. That's what they're designed to do. Democracies are really increasingly struggling to generate positive electoral outcomes in this milieu. If we don't have positive electoral outcomes, we don't have good policy outcomes. If we don't have good policy outcomes, we have malicious, self-serving policy outcomes that always favor oligarchs. And that means archives and other longitudinal functions of government, which aren't really that sexy or easy to describe, will tend to suffer in this milieu. Next. Okay, Canadian context. I'm going to employ Occam's razor and say that we have no constitution in this country because it contains a notwithstanding clause. Any document that contains such a clause does not have the purpose of serving as a constitution. It is the purpose of serving as a get out of jail free card for people in power. Weak federal government, very little public trust of government, weak civil libertarian tradition, almost no public expectation of government accountability. That means grossly under-resourced public archives and no real public records law. In contrast to almost every other major jurisdiction in the wealthy world, almost all public records are permanently classified by default in Canada. I do want to cover like one more thing, so we can skip a couple slides here. I'm going to just read. Archives are a necessary but not sufficient constituent of just and competent societies. It's possible to overstate the discursive weight and legacy of archives or the archive when it may be more sensible at macro scale to think of them as tools which can be resourced to varying degrees and deployed to various ends. While I acknowledge that democracies cannot do without archives, and I have deep misgivings over whether Canada's commitment to the public record enables it to clear that bar, I also think we're trapped in a paradox where improvement to archives are going to flow from improvements to democracy, not the other way around. I don't concede. I think it's wrong to concede. Constitutionally bounded macro scale political processes are irrelevant, that they're beyond our scope to influence, or that the state and its archives only exist as a counterfactual to justice and community. To do so is to concede the collective project of democracy is already dead, which I can't help but think we haven't perhaps interrogated as much as we should. I think we have the right and the obligation to expect better of our governments, and our collective power to advocate for real improvements to archives can only better every element of our discourse. Archives do have power. There's a reason, for example, the Russians set fire to the archives of the secret police in Chernihiv in the very first days of the current war. That wasn't just a symbological act, that was an act against infrastructure. We steward that infrastructure together, or we leave it to rot, or we permit it to be subverted by a permanently unaccountable ruling class. As for the archival future, it doesn't really matter what I think. I'm grateful to the people in this room for helping us imagine it, and I'll close with a deep expression of gratitude to all the archivists, librarians, and memory stewards who have helped to transmit these records and these conversations to us. Respect to the labor, and thank you. Woo! Woo, woo!
That was amazing, Myron. Thank you so much. I love what you said about archives being tombs. All right, we have our next speaker up, and let's give a round of applause for Michelle. Woo!
Muted. Yeah.
Michelle, can you hear me? Sorry, we cannot hear you. Can you take a look at your audio settings and make sure that the correct input is set there in the Zoom? Thank you. Maybe we can switch to a different speaker for now, and I'll direct message with Michelle and try and figure this out.
We are going to switch to our next speaker, just while we figure out some technical difficulties there. So I'm going to pass it along to Denali, who's joining us for the university version of chat.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Sanse, hello. My name is Denali. My family is from Muskogum, Saskatchewan, Treefort Territory. They are Naheo, Soto, and Chicago Line Métis. They adopted me as a child and raised me with a strong sense of community and culture. They adopted me in accordance with our customary laws They are my family, my culture, my identity, but not my ancestry. For my PhD work, I worked with my community of Muskogum First Nations to gather stories of Indigenous heroes. Our goal was to amplify community narratives that celebrate Indigeneity. And by mapping these stories, oh, is my sound doing the thing? Sorry, guys. Half the time it does it, and I never know. Let me switch and see. Okay, let me know if this one starts going in and out too. This one. No, now you can't hear me at all.
No, that was better. That was good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep that.
Okay, we keep this one. Sorry, I have yet to figure out why it does it. So, okay. So, by mapping these stories of Indigenous heroes to the land, my work explores how they contribute to a larger conversation on Indigenous identity, culture, and nationhood. This story work is what brings me here today to be a part of this panel. Through my work, analyzing and mapping 500 Indigenous hero stories from 7 communities, including my own, I found that 76% contained land-based references, not as a backdrop to the stories, but as the mechanism through which knowledge transmits across generations. For example, one storyteller shared what their grandfather had taught them, that land is our storybook. It is our school, our library, our church. It is where we learn our stories and where we discover who we are as Dene people. And that follows through to Saulteaux people and other Indigenous people. This isn't metaphorical. In another story, a grandfather's daily walks wore a path into the land that became both a physical landmark and a living memory to their grandchild. That path itself functions as an archive, transmitting knowledge about discipline, devotion, kinship through the act of walking it. These embodied archives are not exceptional, but typical. They challenge us to ask what counts as an archive and who decides. By mapping these hero stories as kinscapes, the living geographies of kinship, I found that these stories aren't about land. They're about knowledge transmission through land. And that transmission has a spatial boundary. Most land-based knowledge transmission between heroes and storytellers happens within 50 kilometers, because you cannot archive embodied practice. You must live it. These aren't just points on a map. They're what I call cartographies of assurgence. They make visible the relational practices and protocols that renew and regenerate kinships. They reveal governance systems where authority and legitimacy flow through the capacity to transmit knowledge, to transmit land-based knowledge, not through institutional positions. When heroes are celebrated for teaching where medicines grow, for how to set nets, for how to care for community, these stories don't just document democratic relations, they actively constitute them. The spatial patterns are significant. Within that intimate radius, stories focus on cultural transmission. Beyond it, they shift to addressing settler colonialism. This suggests that democratic practice at the community level operates through teaching and learning on the land, not through representation or preservation. This challenges Eurocentric and Euro-American archives in fundamental ways. These knowledge systems require relationship and protocol to access. You cannot digitize the relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild learning to gather medicines together. You cannot preserve in a database the authority that accumulates through decades of teaching youth to survive on the land. The archive is the relationship, renewed through each teaching, each season, each story. I mapped 375 unique storyteller hero pairs from those 500 stories. And what I essentially mapped was relationships, not text. Instead of preserving stories, I tracked their movement. I tracked the footprint of stories. Who teaches whom, where that teaching happens, and how it travels across generations as much as across land. The resulting maps don't claim territory. They reveal the pedagogical relationships through which nationhood regenerates itself. This methodology required navigating between knowledge systems, which reveals fundamentally different understandings of how knowledge should be held. One system recognizes knowledge as emerging from relationships. The other treats it as data to be extracted and stored. I will be returning the story bundle to Muskogee. The other communities, the other 6 communities already have their bundles. My community does not yet. I will be returning that story bundle to Muskogee as a community-controlled book, a living resource that contributes to ongoing renewal and regeneration. My dissertation, however, includes only selected stories, recognizing that some knowledge requires lived context to maintain its meaning. This assertion of Indigenous data sovereignty navigates the tensions we'll explore today. Not whether communities have the right to control their knowledge, but how institutions might learn to respect that authority. This differential handling acknowledges ongoing tensions between OCAP principles and institutional data stewardship. The community owns all their stories, but not all stories can travel beyond their relationship, their relational context. What's crucial to remember is that maps and archives aren't colonial interventions. Every culture has their own protocols, their own ontoepistemic approaches. Archives are stories, and all people have stories. Digital tools can honor rather than extract Indigenous knowledge when they are employed to renew those foundations rather than override them. The challenge isn't whether we use these tools, but whose protocols guide their use. My methodology attempts to demonstrate that story work can bridge these systems while maintaining the integrity of each. The story bundle that I hold illustrates that knowledge persists through practice, not preservation. When archives extract stories from their kinscapes, the living networks of relationships that give them meaning, we risk transforming governance protocols into mere narratives and living authority into historical record. So I ask this provocation. What if the most vital archives aren't documents, but the relationships through which knowledge travels? What if we understood archives as kinscapes rather than repositories? As living networks that regenerate with each generation's engagement. Given the dilemmas that we'll explore here today about access, control, and preservation, how might institutions learn to recognize knowledge systems that are already complete, already democratic, already functioning through their own protocols without extracting them from their place? And how can we ask for archives to honor knowledge as alive, connected to place, and held in relationship? I leave you with those questions for now.
I've had a couple opportunities to work with you, and I'm always so grateful to learn from you. So our next speaker who we have up is Michelle. Or, no, I'm so sorry, it's okay.
So I'm a trained archivist, and in my journey becoming an archivist and developing my practice, I realized that I ended up on this path because I grew up seeing memory work and archival work in my home and in my community. Black people are storytellers. We always gather to remember, and this ties directly back to African continent, the traditions of gathering to sing, to drum, storytell, to remember together. And so I've been exploring that in my work through the lens of Black radical tradition, decolonial quantum theory, Afrofuturism. So when I'm in the archives, I'm always thinking about the future. I daydream with Black collections, and I think about why they documented these stories, what they wanted us to know, how they wanted to be remembered, and how that is their way of reclaiming their narrative from what the Canadian government wants us to remember about Black life. And so I see archives through this lens of reclamation and liberation, and also the African diaspora. So when I think of democracy, I think that we need to interrogate how it's actually playing out in real time versus how we imagine it to be. And this version of democracy was created by colonialists who wanted the right to steal land and own Black and Indigenous bodies. So the archive was a tool to solidify their control. And through the lens of white supremacy, there's no room for multiplicity, there's no room for diversity, there's no room for difference of opinion. We all have to be sameness. And that is one of the largest issues that I see in the archives, is that everything is designed through the lens of whiteness, and it cannot hold multiplicity. And this version of democracy that we have, it might give some people some aspect of freedom, but not everyone. And it is also a tool for neocolonialism. And so when you see countries in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, so many of the issues that we see behind that is neocolonialism, controlling their archives, controlling their politics, controlling the narrative of who they are. So these are the issues that I see with democracy as we know it, and how archives are controlled by government. And I think archives for every community is different. For many Black people, archives are living and breathing and are things that are embodied within us, but also can be tangible and material, things that we engage with through community. And the archive as we know it on this land, the conventional archives cannot hold space for that. It wants surveillance, it wants control, it wants isolation. And so many of us see archives as dead spaces, as cold spaces. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing throughout my career is reimagining what these spaces look like by creating events in those spaces for Black people to gather and to feel radical joy, to feel affirmed, to feel that we are co-creating a space where we can imagine our freedom through the gathering, through the remembering of who we truly are. So yeah, I'm excited to be part of this conversation and explore what the future of archives can be, what democracy can be, and how these are intertwined.
so much, Melissa. I love your point about archives being different. I think there's a tendency, unfortunately, to homogenize them sometimes. So I think that's very good content. All right, we will pass it along now to Michelle.
Okay, are you able to hear me now? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So thank you for inviting me to this event and to have these discussions about archives. I am, as somebody said before, from York University. I'm a professor of history at York, and I'm also a part of McMaster through Juanita, who is somewhere there. Okay, so I would like to start and tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking about archives. Since we know that official archives are often the gathering places for the memories of those who are privileged to gather the documents and artifacts that they believe are worthy of preservation, we know that archives are spaces that reflect power, that are spaces and zones of inclusion and exclusion. In places like the Caribbean, which were and are conceived of and constructed as spaces of unabashed exploitation. Those who control the economies, but the politics, the government, and define the society's hierarchies, its barriers, its privileges, were those who determined what the official archives could and should be. Here, imperial overlords and their colonial cousins, as well as the inheritors of those powers, worked tirelessly to limit and exclude ordinary people from full citizenship, the quaint notion of democracy, and from representation in and access to the archives. But what we also know is that whether enslaved or free, colonized or independent, the so-called ordinary people of these small, precarious societies, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps deliberately, have challenged those limitations and exclusions and have written themselves into the archives. Let us examine a few examples of these acts of radical democratization in Jamaica, which of course we all know is the very center of the universe. When the alleged civilized members of the Jamaican Assembly passed an act for the better order and government of slaves in 1696, they laid the foundations for an archive containing laws. Although they were allowed no opportunity to contribute to the official record, the voices of the enslaved shouted from the law archive through every piece of legislation that enslavers enacted in attempts to contain them and to punish them, to punish their disruption of the systems that sought to dehumanize and exploit them, to profit from their unremunerated efforts. Enslaved women like Damsel and Sarah and a male accomplice, along with Molly and Baker, wrote themselves into the island's court archives when all five were convicted for poisoning white residents in St. Mary Parish between July 1807 and August 1808. Similarly, in 1817, in St. Dorothy Parish, Harriet was transported from the island after she was convicted on charges of trying to poison her master with his coffee. And Goodman was sentenced to death in the St. George Slave Court for, quote, feloniously, wickedly, maliciously, and knowingly, end quote, trying to poison Mary Murray, a free woman of color. And in 1825, Caroline Biggs was tried in the same court for, quote, willfully, maliciously, and feloniously, end quote, trying to poison attorney Thomas Spicer. In 1829, the government archives of the Colonial Office recorded the case of Kitty Hilton, a woman enslaved by, quote, the Reverend Mr. Bridges, end quote, who sought the intervention of authorities after she was severely brutalized by this Anglican priest. Although the case was decided in Bridges' favor, Kitty Hilton's testimony against her enslaver and his clear frustration with her, quote, insolence and defiance, end quote, were written into the archives. In 1831, the enslaved mother and daughter, Catherine Whitfield and Anne Amelia King, offered searing testimonies against the Honorable Mr. J.R. Jackson, the Custos of Port Royal, and his wife, who were brought up on charges of, quote, improper severity, end quote, in their punishment of the two women. The archival record of the physical and verbal confrontation in which the enslaved Catherine used expressions, quote, so grossly abusive and so indecent, end quote, that the magistrate could not record, he said. Her words. This served to confirm that although Catherine and her daughter had no standing as subjects, had no standing as citizens, had no standing as persons, by their insistence on justice in an inherently unjust society, they forcefully inserted themselves into the colonial archives and demand that we evaluate the full humanity of their experiences. With the formal end of slavery, the expectations of the formerly enslaved that in freedom they would have access to full citizenship and representation were quickly halted. The colonial authorities created barriers by restricting land sales to an agricultural community and attaching property qualifications to the franchise, ensuring that what resulted was a landless, disfranchised population. These conditions led to the social explosion in Morant Bay in 1865, captured in the imperial and colonial archives, where the state recorded itself having executed more than 450 people, flogged over 600, and burned more than 1,000 homes in response to the people's demand for land and justice. And with the conditions unimproved in the 20th century, the labor and trade union archives depict the repressive responses of the authorities when the working classes dared to demand better wages and working conditions in a series of strikes and riots between 1935 and 1938. By the time the unrest subsided, quote, 8 people had been killed, 32 had been wounded by gunshot, and another 139 had been injured by other means. In the riot's aftermath, more than 800 people were prosecuted, of whom more than half were convicted, end quote. Excluded from the country's government without the franchise, as their ancestors had done, ordinary Jamaicans opened the way for the legalization of trade unions, which gave birth to the major political parties, which ushered in universal adult suffrage in 1944, and the demand for decolonization through the West Indies Federation, and finally, territorial political independence in 1962. They democratized the archives by insisting on their citizenship and on their humanity. If in its narrow definition, democracy is marked by the acquisition of suffrage, it is significant that it took more than a century after the end of legal bondage for the general Jamaican population to gain the right to vote. If there's an expanded expression of democracy, if in an expanded expression of democracy, one could expect the attainment of political independence and a fuller feeling of citizenship, the people would soon learn that the limitations that attended the remnants of colonization, meaning chronic underdevelopment, economic malaise, and socio-political fragility, meant that their democracy was limited. How then can the most marginalized gain recognition as their historical ancestors have done? With no access to the corridors of power, how can ordinary people write themselves into the archives? I have some ideas about that because I have seen poor Black women who work as domestic servants do just that. They've written themselves into the traditional archives. They've written themselves into the newspaper archives with their advertisements offering themselves for labor, and they have written themselves into Jamaica's oral history archives when they have offered their memories to the Jamaica Memory Bank. I believe that this is a model for democratization, and I believe that these women have shown us the way. They are the ones to whom I owe much of my research contributions. They are the ones to whom I dedicate my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. only ordinary people in the archives. More of that, please. I'm going to pass it along to Roberto, our next speaker.
Yeah, hi, and well, can you hear me? Well, okay. So, well, thank you very much for inviting us. This is Roberto Falanga. I'm here with my colleagues José Ribeiro and João Muniz, and I'm gonna share the screen with a short presentation of what we have been doing. No, this isn't working. Can you see? No. Can you see my screen? No.
No.
Okay, I'm almost there. No. So, no. Well, okay, so meanwhile, can you? Okay, can you see it now? Yeah, okay. So sorry for that. So we're gonna present a bit of the work we have been doing for the last 3 years from 2 projects. And yeah, let's say the fil rouge of these 2 projects is about reconvening memories with an idea of sharing these memories with and for the public, with a focus on democratic innovations. So I want to start with this quotation. This is from an interview we had with an international expert on democratic innovations. And she says that what we call democratic innovations is actually emerged after the World War II, first in the United States and Canada, and then afterwards also in Europe and other parts of the world. But what I find it interesting in this quotation is that the underlying idea is that legislators cannot do it all. So I consider these as democratic innovations because it's a sort of outside of the electoral process. So this means that, I mean, we understood this as, let's say, the way through which we could start this historical review on democratic innovations, using this concept as a sort of a label within which we could consider actually a wide range of different practices. So what we did in this project called Inside Them, which is funded by the European Commission, was to unfold this as historical review of democratic innovations with a focus on their role for sustainability. We applied a methodology which complies, I mean, a combination of different methods. We don't have time to go in depth into each one of these methods, but just for you to know, we combined exploratory and scoping reviews of the main literature, but also interviews with quite a lot of international experts. We also collected a lot of data from open datasets, which we could also understand as open archives of democratic innovations. And then we also consulted archives in 9 different European countries. And let me now focus a bit on this part, because this was the archival research we did, not as historians. We are all social scientists in the team. So what we tried to do was to set out a sort of baseline understanding of what kind of practices should be collected through this archival research. So what we did was we prepared a template that was distributed among the members of the consortium so that they could more easily have access to different kinds of information from public archives. And so you can see on your left, this was the template that we used. So it's a quite simple template. And then we organized the information that we got in different categories of understanding. So this is the table that you see on your right is a bottom-up, let's say so, understanding of the different practices that we collected. Let me just go through very quickly on these practices, but first let me say that all the information that we collected is available to the general public. So we have deliverables that are publicly accessible on this historical review, and we also have a podcast on democratic innovations, which also taps into the history of the historical trajectories of participation with a global scope. So the information that we got from the archival research is actually a very interesting set of practices. Let me say that we did this archival research because we also acknowledged how many practices of this kind actually struggle in breaking the ceiling of mainstream narrations on democratic innovations. So we really felt the need to go more in depth. And actually we found, for example, very interesting information about the democratic transition in the Iberian Peninsula, so in both Spain and Portugal. We found a lot of information that we couldn't find in other sources, other official sources about democratic innovations on movements against the state, against top-down decisions, especially related to the nuclear power and ecological movements, especially in Germany, Italy, and Norway. We also found a wide range of different practices defending the commons, especially in Finland and Slovenia. And then also, again, a very wide range of different practices, also in this sense, also very much related to the action of grassroots groups in Estonia and Netherlands. So this is one project. And then let me tell you also something about an ongoing project, which is funded by the foundation, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation here in Portugal. The name of this project is Democratic Innovations in Portugal. And the guiding question here is, what kind of participation has been promoted in Portugal since the fall of the Salazar's dictatorship in mid-70s? So what we have been doing again is to triangulate different methods in order to try to be more rigorous about the information and the data that we were collecting. And in this case, along with the consultation of existing archives, we are also aiming to create a new archive. So an archive in Portugal where at least more information about democratic innovations can be publicly available. We are doing this through different methods, as I said, questionnaires, document analysis of newspaper, but also consultation of local archives in 3 cities, Lisbon, Porto, and Évora, and also interviews with key actors. All of these will be available to the general public soon, early 2026, through this search engine that we have in our website, and also a digital cartography. Let me say that Participedia is also a lovely partner in this project, and we have, of course, learned a lot from Participedia. So let me say some concluding words. As Walter Benjamin says, we really need to be also very aware about the positionality from which we look at the past. And it doesn't mean when we look at the past that we actually recognize it as it really was. So there is always a subjective way of understanding the past. So to conclude, I want to use the 3 questions that were circulated internally to the speakers to give an idea of what we understand from this empirical work done so far. So regarding the first question, what role the archives can play in understanding democracy, we think that both recovering memories through existing archives, and we gave a special attention to sustainability in the first project and Portugal in the second project, but also creating public archives can actually nurture an always contested knowledge on what has been achieved and what has not in our democracies. So this actually can allow building evidence-based and hopefully inclusive action, especially regarding, in our case, in Portugal, colonial legacies that are so central in our history. Regarding the second question, how we engage with archives and counter-archives, in these two projects that I presented, we reconvened official memories from primary and secondary sources. Of course, given the scope and time of our research, we didn't engage directly with counter-archives and narratives, but we tried, as I said, to triangulate sources, and we actually tapped into multiple understanding of democracy and democratic innovations. So what we are trying to do is also to raise awareness on existing knowledge on the one hand, but also on knowledge gaps that dramatically pair to exclusion in knowledge creation on the past. So we believe that the future paths of investigation and action can actually be explored from that. And then last, the third question on how we imagine the future of archives. We think that consulting existing archives and creating new archives rely on rigorous data collection and narrative collection, as well as the reflexivity on the positionality of who was or is in charge of the archiving process. So critical accounts like this are needed to make archives an asset for the future of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I am going to very quickly move on to our last speaker, so we have time for questions. So I'm going to pass it over to Krista.
Thanks so much. So I'm just going to jump right into it. And since a lot of what I'm going to be chatting about today is centered on relationality and how our connections shape knowledge and memory and ways that we understand democracy, I want to kind of begin by situating myself and my relationship to archives and community. I'm a neurodivergent queer settler who lives in Bawating, also known as Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, on the homelands of the Anishinaabe of Garden River First Nation and Batchewana First Nation. Since 2010, I have worked at the Shingwauk Residential School Center, a community-based archives located on the site of the former Shingwauk and Wawanosh residential schools. The center is dedicated to preserving the history of the Shingwauk site, as well as the history of other residential school sites and the broader survivor movement across Turtle Island. Working at the center has profoundly shaped my work as an archivist, a public historian, and a union leader. I'm incredibly grateful for the relationships I have with members of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, folks whose advocacy and dedication goes back to the 1980s, and folks who have taught me a lot about the possibilities of archives as spaces of justice, healing, and community. I want to name a few of those members of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association who have impacted me personally. So Mike Kakagi, Susie Jones, Shirley Horn, Fran Fletcher-Luther, Jackie Fletcher, and Shirley Roach. Their work has taught me so much about archives and the value of community, and I think it's important to name them in this space. My experiences at the Shingwauk Residential School Center and with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association have shown me that archives don't just preserve history, but they can help shape history for community. Archives influence what narratives are remembered, whose voices are centered, and contribute to how democracy is understood and practiced. Archives are directly tied to the state and how the government makes decisions. Who creates records and what records are saved has a direct impact on which narratives are told. So as we know, the government of Canada has repeatedly over-documented Indigenous communities. And much of this information is located in state archives today. These records are often recorded from the perspective of the government or settlers, shifting the power to control narratives away from the communities that the records are actually about. This power further extends into the control of archives. Who is deciding what is kept, what is made accessible, and how material is accessed? Indigenous records are often found in archives where Indigenous communities have little control over their own knowledge and historical narratives. Archives are tied to the power to be remembered, the power to be forgotten, and the power to control narratives that shape society and communities. They're not pristine storehouses of information, regardless of what Indiana Jones showed us. Rather, they're collections of material that are selected and processed based on selection criteria, and often individual archivist decisions. It's horrifying to me that part of my job is deciding what gets kept and what doesn't get kept as a settler working in a residential school archive. I'm very grateful that there's supports put in place where I can go to community and ask those questions. But like if I was to just follow my job description, it would just be me making those decisions. But I think that kind of points to the possibility of community archives, because across communities, people are reclaiming archival power, building their own spaces of memory and resistance. These community archives can shift the story, moving from state-centered control to relational, community-centered practices that embody a more democratic approach to remembering. I think of the Children of Shingwaq Alumni Association, who came together in the 1980s to start their own archive, recognizing that their perspective and experiences at residential schools weren't being preserved or even talked about. The CSA challenged the meaning of archived and approached their work from a community lens. Community archives can and do push back on narratives created by the state. Many community archives, like the Shingwaq Residential School Center, were created to fill in gaps in archival records and historical narratives that were not captured by mainstream archives. Community archives create spaces, or can create spaces, for stories that weren't collected, the voices that weren't valued, and the experiences that weren't considered part of the record can become records in community archives. I often talk about community archives as living archives built on relationality and grounded in a desire to be used, shaped, and sustained by community. Community archives grow through collaboration, relationships, care, and ongoing dialogue. This means holding space for community to define their own archives and ways of remembering and sharing. When archives make space for community agency by enabling people to tell their own stories and control the materials that have shaped their lives, archives can be tools of justice and self-determination. Archives can help us remember differently, help us live differently, and help us be informed about the past and the present. So as we think about these living relational approaches, it's worth asking, what comes next? What does it mean to imagine archival futures that continue this work of care, accountability, and community agency? I don't have all the answers, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. I think, though, when we think about archives and democracy, I think about responsibility. The responsibility to listen, to include, to repair, and to imagine new possibilities of how we remember. I think about the recognition that many more things, such as oral testimony, art, landscapes, the built environment, and the list goes on, need to be included in how we understand the past. That the textual record, the photographic record are just part of the past, and that memory lives in many forms. I also think about social justice and how archival practice can contribute to healing, accountability, and futures grounded in care. But that needs to be done carefully, and that is important work that takes time. As we imagine archival futures, I challenge us to build archives that don't just preserve the past, but work to shape a more just and relational and democratic system and future. Thank you.
Yeah, one more big round of applause for our speakers. Just a few housekeeping things before we get to our questions. So following our question period, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes, we're gonna have a 5-minute break. So you can, grab some food, water, go to the bathroom, question your entire archival experience, which I will be. Please tell me I'm not the only one. So we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have any questions for Michelle, she did just have to leave us early, so she sends her regrets, but we will pass along any questions that you may have to her. So please put them in the chat if you're online, or tell one of us and we'll pass it along. So the way we're gonna do this is I think I'm gonna operate kind of back and forth between our friends in person and our friends online. So if you have a question online, just please raise your hand, and our online team, thank you, will let me know, and then we'll go from there. Sound good? Okay, so I think we'll start with any questions we have in the room first. Yeah.
This is for Melissa. As a Black historian, focuses on Black history, how do you deal with the information that you see, or the images or whatever, the images or the different media you encounter, and what is
You're talking about records of trauma?
yes, that's
Okay.
exactly, and how its impact on collective memory.
Yeah. I am not working in the conventional archive right now, but when I started my practice, I started looking at racist materials and archives, and how we can think about redescription through reparative work. It's very messy, because the way that we describe ourselves as Black people is always evolving, based on politics, based on our consciousness. And it's difficult to do that reparative work and only consult one person or two people because of the confines around budget. So it's messy, but there are a lot of archivists that have tried to do that reparative work. We're still thinking about ways that we can do it differently. But in terms of my personal experience working with those types of materials, I didn't see that many images of Black suffering. I saw other types of images that were quite traumatizing to work with. And I think the issue that I would say especially people of color face in the profession is that people don't know how to hold space for your trauma. And so that can be really challenging.
Matt, do we have anybody online first before I go to Matthews?
Yeah, I had a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just wondering, because I didn't realize that archives also kind of had to make selections on what to include and exclude. And I remember being a bit sad to learn about just that reading is a thing that happens in libraries, and thought that archives went beyond that. So I guess I find the idea of including, excluding a bit complicated, because I feel like it result in some type of value judgment regardless of how you're looking at it. So why don't we just try to preserve knowledge more generally? Why is that something that has to be community based? Is it budgeting constraints?
I can speak to this a little as a working archivist. Yeah, it's absolutely budgeting constraints. That is the #1 driver of the budget decisions we make. And I'll point out that this is an issue that has been explored and contested exhaustively in formal archival theory. There's a lot of discomfort around the word appraisal versus selection, for example, which is, a whole nother spicy conversation. But, in our reality, if we make a commitment to preserve physical records, that is supposed to be in perpetuity. Archives are for life, not just for Christmas. So we're looking at something that's potentially a 200, 300, 400, 500-year resource commitment. We don't control our budget. We are reliant on vibes, politics, goodwill, playing kind of multiple games simultaneously with different levels of funding. And, you know, when I was speaking about memory institutions and archives being grotesquely underfunded, that does have a very, very direct bearing on our ability to exercise what I think most people on this panel would see as a, you know, we might disagree about interpretation, but I think everybody sees a moral imperative to preserve more inclusive and just histories. And that interstice where the rubber hits the road of like, where's the money? What's the real estate? Can I keep the environmental controls going? Can I even keep them? What do I do if I get mold in the stacks that wipes out and causes health problems for my staff? And that's where I live, and that's where a lot of our colleagues live every day.
Can I add to that?
So,
Sorry, did you want to go ahead? Do you have a follow-up question?
no, it's okay. Yeah, it is a follow-up question. I was just wondering why there isn't a stronger emphasis on digital preservation than if a lot of it is making long-term commitments. Like, is there something behind that I'm not realizing? Because like, I feel like that'd be easier than climate control stuff.
Digital preservation is extremely complicated, expensive. There are standards for trusted digital repositories that most institutions cannot meet.
Yeah.
Also, it is impossible to preserve and collect everything. If you think about how often you're creating a digital record, a physical record, plus embodied memories, we cannot physically preserve everything. There has to be some kind of selection process. So that's what complicates this as well. And then also many communities feel historically excluded from the conventional archives that have most of the wells. So there is some level of relationship repair that people expect from institutions, which is another complicated and messy process for many institutions, especially because a lot of institutions see this as a institution to institution relationship, but many communities see it as people to people because relationships are personal connection. So the politics around that often complicates it. And there's so many communities that have been excluded. So there's so many communities that need to be brought back into repair.
I think what we will do, just for the sake of time, I've seen some online questions and I know there's a question in person. So if we'll just move on to the next one, so that's okay. I think what we're gonna do is I'm going to get all three to ask their questions and then we'll open the floor to panelists and you guys can kind of address which ones you'd like to answer as you go. Does that sound good? Okay, so why don't we start with Matt?
Very quickly. So thank you for your talk. I'm interested in the experience of bringing the Black community into the archive, and specifically, does that change the way once you have those how does that interaction go? Like what do you learn? What's that like? Could you speak to that? And number two, how does that change or manifest in your archival work and practice? Does that influence, like you said, it's a living memory? You know, does that change your archival practices and curation?
And then I think our second hand was Bravo Online. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
You pronounced it perfectly. Hi, everyone. My name is Garo Mangena. I am a futures researcher at SAIA, focusing on governance and democratic futures. And my question is for Melissa, because she mentioned how, you mentioned how democracy plays in real time and what we imagine it to be, and the lens that it currently plays off of, like the white supremacy lens, which in our context, I'm from South Africa. I'm in South Africa, actually. And the entire idea of democracy is quite Western. So in most African countries, if you see, or the model of democracy that's being implemented is a very one size fits all. And that's why most African countries are failing to even produce democratic governance. And we don't even understand what it looks like in practice. And that's obviously because of the colonial history and everything. And I want to ask, how do we actually reclaim democracy that reflects the multiple identities of Africans, as much as keeping in mind, the fact that we are a very diverse continent in general, and even a country ourselves in South Africa. We have like 12 official languages and and so on. And in a sense, it feels very difficult to try and unite all the voices towards a shared democratic idea. So how do we reclaim that as Africans, considering the fact that we've had a colonial past that got rid of all our archives as we understood democracy as a value, such values that we carry like Ubuntu or Ugama or Jama and so on. So like, yeah, I don't know. I hope that makes sense as a question.
You want to ask the last question?
And then Joy, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Joy. I'm a doctoral student at Carleton. My question is about the migrated archives. And so this referred to the documents that were taken out of different colonies by the British before they formally decolonized in places like Africa, Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. And these documents came to light just a few years ago during the Mau Mau case to actually validate, quote unquote, the oral testimonies that, these fighters were given of the experience of colonial violence and torture. And so, since then, and even in the period before, there's been a lot of, efforts by governments and other kind of activistic and archivistic groups to kind of call for the return of these documents. And so my question is, what is the value of returning these documents if they are clearly excluding of these oral testimonies? They're completely colonial documents and excluding of the other stories, like we're talking about how memory contains other stories as well. It's excluding of these oral testimonies of the actual survivors. And then B, how does it enrich our understanding of scholarship and knowledge if it is written entirely from this colonialist perspective? Is there value in actually bringing them back? And C, we have seen some kind of efforts. So the Kenyan Migrated Archives were recently returned in December in hard drives, but the originals are still in London. What does liberation and archival futures look like in this case? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, everybody. Roberta, you had your hand up. Would you like to respond first?
Well, yeah, actually, I had a comment on the digitalization of archives, but then meanwhile, I saw that there is a question for us in the chat. So I don't know if it's time to answer the question or if you want me just to add something on the digitalization of archives.
Yes, thank you. So if there's questions in the chat, just for my friends online, we will get to them, even if we're not reading them out right now. But I promise you, we will get to the questions in the chat as well. But if you wanted to add something first, to the first question.
Yeah, I mean, no, about the actually the digitalization of archives is it's a huge issue. And I wanted to just add that in our case, we, along, of course, with many contentious issues that this raises, and then colleagues of the panel already made clear, there are also very practical issues that regard, for example, it's not just about going digital, it's also about providing with digital tools for example, good search engine, to make, good searches through through these digital archives. We struggled a lot, for example, with all the municipal archives that we have consulted throughout. And there is actually an issue also on searching using, for example, keywords that we are interested in. So the archives, it's not just about going digital, it's also about providing them with all the tools that we need to make good searches. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add this. It's just to add a layer of complexity to what we mean by digitalization.
Thank you so much. Melissa, I know kind of qualify with your answer. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So I think I I tried to just like explore and experiment with things, and then through doing that, try to find language for what I'm doing. So I decided that from my daydreaming practice with archives, I was going to make events to bring people into the archive so that they could see it through the lens that I was seeing it. Because there was when I started I was working at the provincial archives, and when I started working there, Black people didn't go there unless they found out whatever they were looking for was only there. So it was a way to invite people in and to co-create spaces with them and talk about archives rather than through the lens of Black struggle, talk about it through the lens of Black dreaming and liberation. And these people took photographs because they were thinking about the photographs surviving beyond them. So there was something that they wanted to be remembered for. So that's how I started doing that. At first, people were excited about the idea, but very few people came. And what I realized was that people didn't know who I was and they didn't know the institution. So I started to talk about my work more when I went to community events. So after that, people were coming, the room was always full. People just start sharing it with others. If I see people at an event, they say, oh, I told this person that you do this workshop and you have a workshop coming up. So community has been supporting me a lot in that, which is great. And it feels like a way for them to reclaim the space and to reclaim the gathering that we always used to do that's kind of been fractured because of racial capitalism. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And then was it Karabo about democracy? So my family is Jamaican. I have friends who are African who, we have a lot of conversations about politics and culture and identity and Black thought. And so I have heard Africans say that the democracy is a very Western concept. And I can understand that as well. And I think it's also really created through the lens of whiteness, which is why it's this idea of all must fit into one specific thought, identity, sense of professionalism, politics, all of that. And I think a return to a traditional understanding of human systems of whatever ancestral wisdom there was that kind of held space for more complexity and more of a communal way of understanding that relationships and power shouldn't be these rigid hierarchies. I think that's what people should try to return to and find ways that it can interplay with each other and evolve with each other instead of trying to force one singular understanding of politics and society. And the last person to ask a question about migrated archives that were stolen by colonial powers. I want to share that there's a Caribbean historian named Audra Adipti who specifically studies colonial archives in the Caribbean and how they have been secretly removed from European powers. And she looks at these histories through the lens of liberation because authoritarianism and colonialism tries to control the narrative of communities, societies, countries through the archives. And when they remove it, then they have the power to control that narrative. And so your country reclaiming that means that you can control and guide the narrative and also fill in the gaps and the cracks from what they are intentionally trying to out to tell a more full, complete story of your history and how you are trying to reclaim your power. And in that way, it is a way of trying to bring about your liberation through reclamation.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Just being conscious of time, I think we have time for two very quick last questions. I saw two hands up. So Vera, if you wanted to ask online, and I think Dr. Bell, we had a question in person, and then after that, we will go on our break.
Sure, I can ask my question. Thank you very much for an engaging and exciting panel. I've really enjoyed the chats that we're having. And my question comes back to the issue of digitization. I'm working in digital history and digital archives. And what I'm wondering and what I'm seeing is digitization promoting democracy as we say, or is digitization becoming increasingly commodified and something that is ingested, for example, by AI and then spit back to us in a commodified manner? So is digitization causing us more harm in the end? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
I'm a giant grump, and I'm gonna say I'm far closer to your latter than your former characterization on that one. Digitization is cantilevered out at the end of a really long series of decisions about resource allocations. It's the last one. Okay, so that's actually gonna create something even narrower, even weirder, and even more conditional than the corpora from which those records are drawn. I say it's a terrible idea, but every time you digitize something, based on our understanding of the permanent impacts of the technology we currently have, every time you digitize something, you're taking water away from a community somewhere, every single time, forever. There's gonna be a water cost, there's gonna be a heat cost. Everything we digitize makes the world end faster. That's the paradigm that we're currently in. And I think you're really right to point to the kind of pernicious AI scraping behaviors. On one hand, digitization is a great way of facilitating access in some states. And I look at some of the work our colleague Heather George is doing here in Canada at the Woodland Cultural Center around digital repatriation, which also kind of addresses that question about, you know, do we take the records back? Can we steward them if we do? Are there ways of working with kind of with other institutions to facilitate that? But I have a really deep discomfort with awareness of the kind of technological fragility of the stack. The real challenge of migrating digital data forward through time in forms that's even readable, because proprietary IP is a whole nother intensity in archives. Anybody that's ever opened a Word document on two computers and had two different sets of formatting, that's within one company's closed IP loop. You're not actually reading the same document anymore. That is a legal implication for the evidentiary application of that document. So like, I know I'm yarn boarding here, but it's a mess, and it's a lot messier than people think it is.
Dr. Bell.
I actually wanted to hear what Krista and Denali might have to say about two of the things that have come up. The first being this experience of welcoming folks physically into the record spaces they are subject to, and the other about this question of repatriating archives as it shows up in the work that the two of you are doing.
No, go ahead, please.
Happy to chat about the spaces and welcoming people into spaces. I would say a lot of the work that I do in the Shingwauk Residential School Center as a community archive, we're not set up as a regular archive space. It's a much more community-centered, welcoming space with comfortable seating. Yes, there are desks where you can spread out material and look at, but we welcome families and first-time archival users into that space quite often, as well as survivors and intergenerational survivors, and have intentionally tried to make the space feel comfortable. I recognize that's not the generic archival experience that most people necessarily have. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from that lens. In terms of digitization, I really struggle with this question from someone who works in a small archive that is staffed by 2 people. We literally cannot digitize everything, and we have to make choices about what gets digitized and what doesn't. And those choices, in my case, need to be guided by community, not by me.
I wanted to give a very quick last answer, then we'll wrap up.
All right, so basically same. My community, we have the last standing residential school in Saskatchewan. And rather than take the money the government was offering to remove it, my community said, if there are no residential schools, if there are no physical archives, what evidence do we have? The government's not very good at keeping its word or honoring the truth. So we've kept it and found our own funding sources to make it a historic site. And we're working with the UN now to make it a historic site at that scale. And we're turning it into similar to the Xinguo idea, where this is a space of community. This is a space of healing, of truth, of memory, of memorial, of imagination, of all of these kinds of things. And so those spaces are very different than what we tend to think of when we look at dominant colonial notions of what an archive is, where everyone should be quiet and not touch anything. And there's a hierarchy of how you can move through the spaces and content. This is very different. There are children running and screaming. There is engagement in life, because the archive is the fact that we are there, we exist. We are the living archive of what could not be destroyed. And so it's a very different fundamental foundation of what these spaces are. And so I'll leave it with that, because I think the rest has kind of already been covered.
Thank you. All right, my friends in the chat, there's so many questions and not enough time in the world, but you have my word that we will get your questions to the right panelists and answered for you. For everybody else here, we are going to go on a 5-minute break. So it's 2:41 right now. Please be back here by 2:46. Thank you so much. Okay. You know, break. We are out of time for break, so we're gonna get back to it. Once everybody is sitting down and ready, I'm gonna pass it over to Jessie Carson as the Participedia for our next activity. Yeah, I think we're gonna move on really quickly. Jessie, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. I'm Jessie Carson. I'm Participedia's design director. Can you folks hear me over there? My audio is working? Getting a nod, thanks. Okay, I got a woo, yay, hi, Paul. This has been such a great workshop so far. Wow, really, really interesting presentations. Our next phase is going to be a bit more participatory. We're going to have some discussions in the room and online using some really interesting archival dilemmas scenarios that were developed by the team that organized this workshop. This is drawing on Participedia's approach to integrating a little bit of design thinking as a collective processing method for these topics that we're engaging with in democratic innovations. And so what will happen next is you'll be put into small groups with a facilitator, either in person or online. You'll be assigned one of these really interesting scenarios of something that could be happening within different kinds of archives and democracy. And you'll use this simple template to unpack and discuss the problems that are being faced in a scenario, who's involved, who are the people and communities involved in this archival scenario, what are the power dynamics within this scenario, and what is at stake, what are some of the challenges and conflicts that are coming up within the scenario. And then, so that's kind of 1, 2, 3. And then finally ending the discussion on some idea generation. What are the paths forward for the actors within the scenario being presented? And so that just gets us kind of drawing on some of the things we've heard from the talks today and some of our own work, thinking generatively together as a way of kind of getting our ideas on the table together. So that's the activity. Hopefully we'll have about 15, maybe 20 minutes. If everyone doesn't mind staying a little bit longer than the event was scheduled for, we can get some of this work done together, then come and close together in the plenary. So with that, I think we have breakout groups ready on Zoom, and the in-person work, there will be handouts going around. Yeah, so have fun and we'll come back together shortly.
All right, guys, we're gonna come back to the larger group.
Where you'll say to make good fiscal policy. Are you, that made me think when you were saying, there's this bit about innovation.
All right, guys.
If we want to have innovation.
We are very pressed for time, so we're gonna come back to the larger group. I think we're going to start with Jessie, who's gonna give a couple of reflections from what they were doing on the Alliance Sphere, and it's just gonna pass it back over to me, and I'm gonna make a couple, 1 to 2 comments from the room, and then we're going to wrap it up. So Jessie, I'll pass it to you first.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, the fun part about doing anything like this is that it's too fun. We just don't want to stop. I totally understand. But yeah, let's have a real quick share back. Maybe 1 or 2 folks from the online group, and maybe a couple of folks from the room would volunteer just by putting your hand up if they have anything that came to mind that was interesting from their conversation. We don't have time for a play-by-play, but just an insight that stood out for you from this activity or from the speakers and how it connected to the scenarios. The floor is open, and we'll take the first couple of folks who put their hands up, and then we'll close together. I see a hand online. Laura, go ahead.
Hi, I was with Jose, I think, and we were on scenario 4 of the National Archive Policy, and I started by like reading out the question out loud, and it was just the senior bureaucrats caution that expanding the archive's mandate to include grassroots or activist archivists risks politicizing the institution, and I had to repeat that to myself several times because what do you think the institution is, guys? The National Archive. It's already politicized, guys. I feel like in the how does power work here section, we had some interesting thoughts. Like the first thing I put down was that the cabinet is going to have the final say or veto, but in contrast, also, the cabinet absolutely doesn't have capacity to manage every single like aspect of this archival policy. And in fact, they may not be paying particularly much attention if so there's sort of a power of like that the archivists and whatever advisors or consultation is creating this archival policy / mandate, whatever, is going to be approved by the government. But I mean, even if the government is urging a safe route of national pride without controversy, they may not necessarily be paying enough attention to totally oppose any more radical activities you may want to include in it.
Sneak some stuff in there. Hey, yeah, nice. Thanks, Laura. Appreciate that. Sarah, is there someone in the room? And then maybe we'll hop over to Roberto.
So we discussed scenario 2, the partnership dilemma, and we have a situation where the institution has what is it called, an administrator, and then an indigenous community trying to create an archive. And we discussed the fact that power is imbalanced here. The power goes to the institution and to the administrator, and very little go to the community. But I'll quickly mention the path forward that we discussed, which is someone brought up that the principles of community. What's the principle of community engagement? That's a really great place to start. The principles of community engagement, especially this balance of power. And Melissa raised the idea of reconciliation coming from the indigenous area, that they are trying on their own terms, which is very important because if the power is with them, they can decide what stories are told, what is documented, and all of that. But also importantly is the idea of funding. If the funding goes to the institution or to the administrator, then the power is always almost concentrated on their hands and nothing goes to the indigenous communities. But if the funding goes to community members directly or in some way to them directly, then that power imbalance is kind of rectified in some ways. Yeah, that's the gist of the whole thing.
Awesome, thank you so much. Should we pass it back to Roberto and then maybe one more person in the room?
Yeah, very quickly, also because my university is closing, so I have to leave in a couple of minutes. So we discussed the National Archive, and it was a very interesting discussion. I would just maybe stress a couple of things. One is we had a discussion about what we mean by community groups and activism. In that, I mean, in the case study, it was not entirely clear whether we are talking about progressive movements or I mean, what kind of political instances these community groups are leading. And I think this is relevant if we want to actually unpack what we mean by, for example, national identity that should be sponsored by this National Archive. And on the other hand, I mean, we also figured out what could happen if we go for the most radical solution, which is revolution. And so we don't want to have the National Archive, and or we boycott the National Archive, and then we create an alternative archive or a counter archive. And then, of course, we discussed about also practicalities. How do we fund a counter archive? So how can we manage it? How can we make it sustainable also over time? We don't have answer, unfortunately, but I think, I mean, thank you again, because it was a great experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roberto, and please thank the university for us as well for staying open so late. All right, do we have anyone want the last word in the room? We can have one more person wrap up. I know that's a really big ask for the last word, but if not, we can also go to
Well, sure. Sure. So we discussed scenario number 4, also the National Archives. I'm just going to fast forward to the path forward for that. So the main points are that the archives are servicing the public. We need, despite the fact that policies exist to regulate archives, what we really need is legislation. So legislation that actually makes these archives accessible and that declassifies documents and makes them accessible to the public in a reasonable amount of time. And then the whole point of this is for transparency. So democracy is facilitated by trust in government and trust in the public. And for that to exist, one has to be transparent. Both the public and the government have to have an understanding that they're going to tell and show the truth to one another. And so when you have when only scandals can bring forth the drive and the desire for transparency, that sort of is a symptom of perhaps distrust within a democracy. And so I guess I'd like to end, transparency is the ultimate goal. Perhaps we need a social movement around transparency. We need a scandal for the sake of transparency.
Put it on a t-shirt.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I know we've gone a roughly half hour over time. I appreciate you all staying with us online and in person. I just wanted to extend an offer of community to join Participedia more formally. If you are interested in any of our offerings, you want to learn more about our research clusters, the teaching, training, and mentorship work that we do, how we engage communities around the world to deliver unique programming, please feel free to reach out, to email info@participedia.net, or just to come up and talk to one of us directly. That offer of community, we would welcome you as fellow Participedians. And then secondly, I noted in the beginning that in the winter term, we're going to have a part 2 of this session, right? So I will invite you all to attend either virtually or in person, where we'll be engaging with, I can note, because we have some confirmations, 2 Palestinian archivists will be here, and then we have some more indigenous archivists and so on. So we're going to extend this conversation, keep the momentum going. There's no closure, there's no final answers yet. The idea is that hopefully we can snowball this kind of community that we're creating here into a volume. And I know that you're all doing fantastic work as part of your dissertation and in your studies. And so we invite you to respond to that public call for papers for that edited volume, right? There'll be a lot of flexibility in terms of that type of contribution, and we'll workshop together as a community what that volume will look like in its totality. But that being said, I just can't thank you enough to our speakers, Melissa, Myron, everyone else, Michelle, Denali, Roberto. Bonnie, is that you joining us from COP? Oh my gosh, even Bonnie made it here. Just a big round of applause to everyone. And until next time, check out Participedia, please.